Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories of people who went deep into Appalachia, into its most remote corners, expecting peace and solitude, but instead finding things truly terrifying. From cabins being broken into, to people hiding dark secrets for years, to serial killers still out there on the loose. Every one of these stories shook me, but the last one, it left me completely unsettled, because there's simply no explanation for it. Pure evil and psychopathy like that gets under my skin. I hope you enjoy this video as much as I did putting it together. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. I own a small cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains. It isn't anything fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. But it's my little escape whenever life in the city starts to grind me down. Whenever I feel burned out or need to clear my head, I pack up the truck and head there. It always felt like my safe place. This was back in 2019. I'd just driven about 8 hours north, and by the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was long gone and the forest was pitch black. The final stretch of road is narrow, with tree branches that scratch against the side of the truck if I'm not careful. I pulled up around 8 p.m., relieved to be there. First thing I always do is fire up the generator, then haul my luggage inside. But that night, the second I unlocked the front door, I noticed something was off. The air inside was colder than it should have been, colder even than outside. More than that, I felt a draft and pushed the door. When I flicked on the light, my stomach dropped. One of the living room windows was completely shattered, glass all over the floor. I froze in the doorway for a good minute, my mind racing. I forced myself to do a walkthrough, gripping a fireplace poker like a weapon. But nothing seemed disturbed. The drawers were untouched, the kitchen cabinet still closed. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. Besides that, there were no marks on the ground. It had rained all week, so if anyone had come through there, they would have left footprints. The truth is, I hadn't been up to the cabin in about a year, so that window like that could have been something old. So I told myself it had to have been an animal. Maybe a bear had smelled something, pawed at the window, then left when it didn't find food. I'd seen claw marks on trees near the cabin before, so the thought wasn't far-fetched. Still, my nerves were a bit frayed. Since it was too late to drive back into town for supplies, I nailed an old piece of wood I had lying around over the opening to block out the cold and sleep more comfortably. Still, it was fragile, and if someone wanted to, they could easily get in. I set some firewood in the fireplace, lit it, and soon the cabin glowed with that soft orange light I'd always loved. I made myself a quick sandwich, poured a whiskey, and curled up on the couch with a book. I was reading The Collector by John Fowles, and the irony of reading a horror book in a situation like that didn't escape me. Maybe next time I came up to the cabin, I'd bring something a little lighter and more uplifting. Despite the broken window, the sounds of the forest drifting in were oddly calming. Crickets, the occasional owl, the pop and crackle of the fire. It didn't take long before my eyelids got heavy. Around 11, I topped off the fire, shut the lights, and went to the bedroom. I set my alarm for 7 a.m. on my phone. I always keep it on the nightstand, and drifted off. Then, at 2:34 a.m., I jolted awake. My chest was pounding like I'd been yanked out of a nightmare, but I couldn't remember what I'd been dreaming about. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But something felt wrong. The way I had just woken up had been a bit violent, and it left me feeling suspicious. I got up, phone in hand out of habit, and carefully cracked open the bedroom door. The glow from the moonlight partially lit the hallway, just enough for me to see. I pressed the light switch, but nothing turned on. Something urged me toward the window I'd found broken, and that's when I noticed the piece of wood I'd nailed over it was lying on the floor. My stomach flipped. I stepped closer and saw muddy boot prints leading in from the broken window. My throat went dry. I followed the prints with my eyes, across the floor, down the hall. They stopped right where I was standing. Slowly, I turned my head and realized they continued into the bedroom I'd just come from. I felt cold all over. By this point, my subconscious already knew I wasn't alone in that cabin. I forced myself back into the room, and that's when the horror hit me. The prints didn't stop at the doorway. They went right up to my bed, and there were no tracks leading away. I thought about moving closer to the bed and peeking underneath, but it wasn't necessary. Every part of me knew someone was there. I stepped back, and the person, sensing that I knew, lifted their head and smiled at me. A smile that was pure psychopathy. I shot upright so fast I slammed into the doorway, nearly knocking the breath out of myself. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed my keys, clutched my phone, and sprinted out the front door. I didn't even think. I just jumped into the truck, locked the doors, and tore off down the dirt road, branches scraping the sides. Halfway to town, I finally caught my breath enough to call the police. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. They told me to head straight to the station, and by the time officers drove back with me, it was nearly 4 in the morning and the intruder was gone. The prints, the glass, the blanket, all still there. But whoever it was had vanished into the woods. The next day, I replaced the window, patched up the cabin, and, most importantly, had a proper alarm system installed. But even then, fear kept me away. For 3 years, I couldn't bring myself to return. I packed my bags countless times and even made it all the way to the cabin. But the moment I stepped inside, the terror from that night came rushing back and I couldn't sleep. So I always ended up driving back home. I came close to selling it, but my conscience wouldn't let me list the place knowing what had happened. Finally, about 2 years ago, I went back. This time, I brought my girlfriend with me. And yes, she knew the whole story. But even so, she was willing to help me reclaim that cabin. Having someone else there made it easier. We stayed the weekend, and everything was perfectly normal. We started going up together a couple of times a year, and for a while, it felt like the nightmare had finally passed. I even started to feel like a coward, as if I'd blown the whole thing into more of a drama than it really was. Until last night. We were in bed when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the leaves outside, circling the cabin. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone trying the window latch. The same window from before, and every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't hesitate. I yelled at the top of my lungs that the police were already on their way. The noise stopped instantly, followed by a long silence. Even my girlfriend, who'd woken up to my shout, knew exactly what to do. We didn't sleep after that, just sat up until the sky started to lighten. I don't know if they left because of my shouting, or if they're just biding their time. All I know is the forest doesn't feel like my refuge anymore. It feels like someone else's hunting ground. I still think about that night, even after more than 25 years. It's the kind of memory that grows and shrinks, but never really fades. Back then, I was 15, stuck in the same hollow of the Appalachians my family had been tied to for generations. Like roots too deep to pull out. Thatcher was 15 too. His family, another branch tangled into the same ridges. Our parents saw the mountains like you see the weather, always there, steady. The old folks, though, they treated those hills like a rule book. Every ridge and trail with its own warning. We grew up drowning in stories about those woods. The kind you laugh off as kids, but still carry in the back of your mind. Around here, nobody went out after dark. When we were little, it felt like some silly superstition old people clung to. But by the time we hit our teens, the laughter had turned into a dare we kept tossing back and forth, daring each other to push against it. We talked big about proving those stories were just made up. But deep down, we both knew they might not be. That's why we kept putting it off, waiting for the perfect night to finally test it. We were young and completely stupid. We lacked the maturity to understand that all those stories, no matter how ridiculous they sounded, always have a kernel of truth. Finding that truth is like a game. It can go very well and you walk away with one hell of a scare. Or it can go very badly and you lose your life. Another thing that made us postpone our midnight trips into the mountains was that our parents were always home and watching. We'd only recently earned a little more freedom, and if they caught us lying, if they found us out after dark, they'd lose it and stop trusting us. But finally, September came, and with it, the perfect opportunity. My parents had both taken vacation around that time, and they'd been talking about visiting my mom's sister for at least 2 years. They knew I couldn't go because of school, so they agreed to let me stay home. Thatcher was coming to spend those 2 days with me, and that made my parents feel more at ease. Little did they know, it was precisely when we were together that all the real trouble always happened. I'll admit that even then, we both hesitated a little before stepping out. We were scared shitless. It was one thing to fantasize about it, but a whole different reality to actually go through with the plan. In the end, we pushed each other, and a little after midnight, we finally left. We didn't want to risk a neighbor spotting us and running off to tell our parents. Plus, going out after midnight added another layer of fear. And at that point, all we really wanted was the rush of adrenaline. Each of us had our own bike, and even though we didn't know exactly where we were headed, we knew it took about 15 minutes of pedaling to reach a spot that was even remotely interesting. The first thing I noticed, something I already knew but wasn't truly prepared for, was just how dark the night really was. Even knowing it, neither of us was ready for the absolute blackness we faced. It felt like we were riding through a tunnel, and the farther we pedaled, the deeper we went into that darkness. We ended up stopping our bikes in a small clearing by the road. It wasn't likely that a car would come through there, but we still decided it was better to be cautious and hide them back in the trees. That's when we saw a car, tucked halfway into the woods. The sight of it terrified us, but at the same time the rush was so strong we could barely hold it in. Who the hell would be out there in the middle of the forest, and why? It was the perfect adventure for two dumb 15-year-olds. So, without thinking twice, we started walking through the trees, daring whoever might be out there. It was thrilling, fear mixed with curiosity. Every sound in the forest made us jump. A branch here, another over there. We knew they were normal noises. Both of us had been there during the day. But at night, everything was amplified. Every sound a potential threat. Still, we kept moving, hearts hammering, until we saw him. He was standing just a little deeper into the trees, partially hidden by shadows. He was turned away from us. And at that moment, any trace of a joke we might have had was gone. We were both obviously terrified and regretting putting ourselves in that situation. He held a shovel in his hand, striking something on the ground. We couldn't see what it was, because without wanting, I stepped on a dry branch that snapped loud. He stopped immediately and turned toward us. The fear that hit me then was unlike anything I'd ever felt. The man wore a white mask that covered his face, but even in the darkness, you could see it was smeared with some kind of grime. Before I even had a chance to warn Thatcher, I bolted. Thatcher screamed behind me and joined the run. We were both panicked, running blindly, knowing that whatever the man was doing was illegal, and he had seen us. We'd heard countless stories of criminals using the mountains as hideouts. We always thought they were just tales to scare kids off the woods, but that night proved they weren't. When we finally reached our bikes, I jumped on. But before I could start pedaling, something grabbed my arm and slammed me into the ground. It was him. Thatcher, horrified, jumped onto his bike and rode off. Honestly, I couldn't blame him. I would have done the same if I could. I thought he was going to kill me. Instead, he lifted the mask to his lips and said in that unmistakable voice that he knew where we lived, and if we told anyone what we had seen, he would destroy us. Then he just stood there, watching as I scrambled back onto the bike, my hands shaking, and pedaled like my life depended on it. Because it did. I've never pedaled so fast in my life, and when I finally reached home, Thatcher was sitting on the back steps, partially hidden, crying. When he saw me, his eyes widened, and all he could manage was a quiet apology. I nodded, and we hurried inside, locking every door and window before spending the rest of the night sitting on the living room floor, talking about what had happened. We never told anyone about that night. We were both terrified. Until now. Unfortunately, Thatcher died of cancer 2 years ago. And after his death, I found myself reflecting on so many things. I felt I needed to finally tell this story. I don't really know what to do with it. Whatever the man was doing that night had more than enough time to erase the evidence. And even though I recognized his voice that night, I still don't know who he was. Two weeks ago, something happened to me on the Pennsylvania section of the Appalachian Trail that I can't get out of my head. I had set out early in the day with the goal of reaching a set of waterfalls that I had read about, the kind that aren't marked on the maps and sit a couple of hours off the main trail. This time of year, the trail is pretty empty, but I've been there before when it's packed with hikers and families. The hike itself was fine, until out of nowhere I heard gunshots. At first I wasn't overly alarmed because the trail is usually busy and I figured it had to be someone being reckless, either hunting where they shouldn't or messing around with target practice. It bothered me, but I kept moving. The plan was to get to the falls before sunset and maybe camp there for the night. About an hour before it started getting dark, I reached them, and I was honestly thrilled by how beautiful and secluded they were. Hardly anyone seemed to know about them. Just as I was settling in, I heard the gunshots again. Only this time they were closer. That hit me differently because I had been off the trail for nearly 2 hours at that point. If the shots carried that far, it meant whoever was firing had also left the trail and was now somewhere deep in the woods near me. Guns had always made me uneasy, and now I couldn't shake the tension building in me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself people shoot in remote areas all the time. But later when I was making dinner, I thought I heard movement nearby. It sounded like someone walking not far from where I was camped, and that sent my nerves into overdrive. I forced myself to finish eating, but I couldn't relax. The idea of someone out there with a gun in such an isolated spot kept gnawing at me. When I had first explored the area, I noticed a shallow cave-like opening in the rock beside the falls, a kind of natural shelter. I had thought it would be a good place to duck into if it rained. But as night came on, I started to think it might be the safest place to sleep. I grabbed my pack and sleeping bag and moved into that little hollow. I was too wound up to fall asleep, so I sat there for a long time watching the water cascade in the moonlight. Even in the dark, the falls were stunning, and for a moment, I almost felt calm. Then I heard footsteps again. Someone was out there. From inside the cave, I could see my campsite, the tent, and my gear. My stomach dropped when I watched a man step out from the trees. He didn't hesitate, didn't try to move quietly. He just walked straight toward my tent. Then, he raised a gun, aimed, and fired into it. I had to press both hands over my mouth to stop myself from screaming. He didn't even check if anyone was inside. He just turned around and walked away, like it was nothing. I stayed frozen in that cave for what felt like forever, completely in shock, before I finally pulled out my phone and called the police. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach me, and only then did I leave the cave. I know an investigation is still ongoing, and I know part of that section of trail has been quietly closed, though nothing official has been said. 2 weeks later, I still haven't heard a single word about it. I know it hasn't been that long and the police are probably still piecing things together, but it makes me uneasy that nothing official has been communicated to the public.